You know what's wild? The smartest people in the room, the ones with degrees, resources, and access to cutting-edge information, have made some of the most astoundingly stupid decisions in recorded history. And I'm not talking about accidents or unlucky guesses. I'm talking about confident, documented, utterly nonsensical moments where NASA scientists and space program officials looked at a problem and arrived at the exact wrong answer. Every single thing you're about to hear actually happened. Moment 1. In the early days of the space program, NASA engineers were convinced that the human body couldn't survive the vibrations of rocket launch. They believed that astronauts would literally shake apart during takeoff, so they designed special isolation systems to protect them. Turns out, the human body is slightly more robust than a sandcastle, and astronauts managed to survive just fine. Moment 2. NASA spent months developing a pen that could write in zero gravity. It cost millions of dollars. The Soviet Union used a pencil. Moment 3. In the 1960s, NASA conducted serious research on whether astronauts could survive on the moon by eating lunar dust. They theorized it might be edible. It wasn't, obviously, but someone got paid to figure that out. Moment 4. Space program officials once proposed launching nuclear weapons into space to test how they'd perform in the vacuum. The idea was seriously entertained before someone eventually asked, "Wait, should we maybe not do that?" Moment 5. NASA designed the original Apollo spacesuits without a way for astronauts to scratch their own faces. They later had to add a special abrasive pad inside the helmet. Imagine being on the moon with an itch you physically cannot address. Moment 6. During early manned spaceflight, NASA didn't give astronauts a reliable way to eat in orbit. The food was so bad and the eating process so complicated that several astronauts just went hungry for days. Ground control, I'm experiencing some discomfort. Yeah, that's probably the starvation. Moment 7. NASA engineers believed that the moon had a thick layer of dust that would swallow landing modules whole. They were genuinely worried astronauts would sink into the surface like quicksand. The dust was real. The quicksand scenario was not. Moment 8. The space program spent enormous resources on developing special systems to deal with the extreme cold of space. Nobody told them that in a vacuum, heat dissipation is actually the primary problem. They had the problem exactly backwards. Moment 9. Early satellite pod designers thought satellites would gradually lose altitude and fall back to Earth within a few years. They didn't account for atmospheric density variations and orbital mechanics properly. Some of the first satellites they expected to fail within months are still up there. Moment 10. NASA once proposed a plan to orbit rockets around the moon to photograph the dark side before ever landing on it. The solution was absurdly complicated when they could have just, landed on it, which they eventually did. Without orbiting rockets, Moment 11, during the Apollo program, Mission Control used slide rules to make critical calculations during flight. Not computers, actual slide rules. One calculation error could have been catastrophic, and yet somehow this system worked for years. Moment 12. NASA designed the original Mercury capsule's emergency escape system to fire the astronaut straight up on a rocket if something went wrong. The problem? If that sequence triggered on the launch pad, it would send the astronaut 1,000 feet in the air with no way to control the descent. Moment 13. Space program officials genuinely believed that exposure to radiation in space would make astronauts' hair fall out permanently. They didn't test this assumption carefully, so they just accepted it as fact and moved forward with planning. Spoiler: astronauts kept their hair. Moment 14. Early NASA designs included a system where astronauts would be tethered to their spacecraft by ropes during spacewalks. They didn't realize that a tangled tether could be more dangerous than no tether at all. Spacewalks became a lot safer once they figured that out. Moment 15. The space program once seriously discussed the possibility of launching astronauts in a capsule that would bounce off the Earth's atmosphere and skip back into space like a stone on water. This was not a backup plan. This was considered a legitimate option for re-entry. Moment 16. NASA believed that cosmic rays would cause severe psychological problems for astronauts in deep space. They conducted extensive studies on this. The actual psychological problem turned out to be the isolation, not the rays, but sure, let's worry about cosmic rays specifically. Moment 17. During Apollo missions, someone decided that astronauts should wear suits that were primarily white because white reflects heat. Nobody mentioned that white also reflects sunlight, which on the moon's surface at full exposure is about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. They figured it out eventually, but not before some uncomfortable moments on the lunar surface. Moment 18. The original design for the lunar module included a hatch that opened inward. This meant that if there was any pressure differential, the astronauts wouldn't be able to open it from the inside. They redesigned it after realizing they'd basically built a trap. Moment 19. NASA once proposed a mission to send astronauts to Venus because they assumed that if life could exist in the swamps of Earth, it could probably exist in the acid clouds of Venus. The acid clouds that are hot enough to melt lead. Sure, why not? Moment 20. Early space mission planners didn't adequately account for the fact that astronauts need to use the bathroom. The first astronauts in space had no reliable system for this, and literally had to hold it for the duration of the mission. By modern standards, this seems insane. By their standards, it was just something you dealt with. Moment 21. NASA commissioned a study on whether the moon might be made entirely of green cheese. Okay, not really, but it wasn't until the 1960s that they were completely certain about the moon's composition, which seems like something you'd want to know before landing on it. Moment 22. The space program designed spacesuits with zippers that were prone to jamming. Astronauts had to be carefully trained on how to open their own suits, and if the zipper stuck, they'd be trapped inside a pressurized piece of clothing in a vacuum. Nothing says engineering excellence like a stuck zipper, being a potential life or death scenario. Moment 23. Mission Control once lost contact with a spacecraft and had no way to re-establish communication except by having the astronauts physically angle the entire spacecraft toward Earth and hope they picked up the signal. This worked, but only because they got lucky. Moment 24. NASA designed computer systems for early space missions that had less processing power than a modern calculator. They were fully aware of this. They did it anyway because that's what fit in the spacecraft. Moment 25. During the development of the space shuttle, engineers proposed that the cargo bay should be pressurized so astronauts could work in it without spacesuits. This would have added enormous weight and complexity to the vehicle. They eventually scrapped the idea, but only after spending millions on development. Moment 26. The space program once believed that the primary danger of re-entry was overheating from atmospheric friction. They didn't fully account for the fact that a spacecraft could also break apart from structural stress. Several near disasters made this point very clear. Moment 27. NASA conducted extensive testing on whether astronauts could safely eat foods that were designed to not produce crumbs in zero gravity. This was important because floating food particles could damage sensitive equipment. The fact that they had to design special food was somehow not a red flag that maybe spaceflight was more complicated than they thought. Moment 28. Early mission planners believed that astronauts would become disoriented in zero gravity and wouldn't be able to function properly. They thought people might lose their sense of up and down completely. Turns out, the human inner ear is actually pretty good at figuring this out, even in space. Moment 29. The Skylab space station was supposed to have a sunshade that would keep it cool in orbit. They forgot to deploy it during launch. The station was overheating dangerously until astronauts manually installed a parasol-like device while in orbit. Yes, they fixed their mistake with a space parasol. Moment 30. NASA once seriously proposed using nuclear explosions to create a highway on the moon for vehicles to drive on. Someone actually wrote this down and presented it as a concept. Someone else nodded along as if this was a reasonable idea. Moment 31. Early satellite designers launched reflective balloons into orbit, thinking they could use them to transmit radio signals. The balloons would reflect signals across the planet. This was the entire idea. No active electronics, just balloons. It actually worked, but calling it a satellite felt generous. Moment 32. The space program designed experiments based on the assumption that there might be life forms on the moon. They sent containers specifically designed to collect and contain potential lunar organisms. When they got to the moon and found absolutely nothing, nobody seemed particularly surprised. If you were surprised, you would have built better collection equipment. Moment 33. NASA once calculated the trajectory for a lunar module descent and forgot to account for the density of the lunar atmosphere. Oh wait, there is no lunar atmosphere. So they did account for it. But the fact that this had to be a specific consideration shows how carefully they had to think through problems. Moment 34. The original design for the Apollo guidance computer used a specific type of wiring that was prone to burnout if electricity surged through it. Astronauts had to avoid certain computer operations during launch because the electrical surge could fry the whole system. Nobody wants their primary navigation computer to have an off switch labeled "Do Not Use During Launch." Moment 35. Space program officials believed that the radiation belts surrounding Earth, later named the Van Allen belts, were so dangerous that passing through them would give astronauts severe radiation poisoning. NASA had to reassure the public that the Apollo missions could pass through safely. They could, but the public fear was real because of this miscalculation. Moment 36. During the development of spacesuits, engineers didn't realize that thermal expansion would cause seals to fail at extreme temperatures. They had to redesign the suits multiple times after the first tests didn't work as expected. Every iteration felt like a surprise, even though thermal expansion has been understood since the 1800s. Moment 37. NASA commissioned a study on whether sound could travel through the vacuum of space and reach astronauts outside the spacecraft. Someone's apparently needed a peer-reviewed paper to confirm that the sound can't travel without a medium. Science is sometimes just confirming what you already know. Moment 38. The space program designed life support systems for the lunar module that barely had enough oxygen for the planned landing and ascent. They had minimal margin for error. If the engines had burned a few seconds longer, the astronauts might not have made it back. They knew this. They did it anyway because it was lighter. Moment 39. Mission planners once calculated that the radiation in space would be so intense that astronauts would receive a dangerous dose after just a few hours of exposure. They prepared for extensive radiation sickness on early missions. The actual radiation exposure turned out to be far less dangerous, but this came as a surprise, even though better measurements would have been simple to make beforehand. Moment 40. NASA designed a system for the International Space Station where all the complex equipment was grouped together in modules. If one module had a critical failure, it could cascade and damage everything connected to it. They've spent the subsequent decades managing this architectural nightmare. Moment 41. The space program once proposed a mission to land on Mars using a direct trajectory that would have required more fuel and time than a more efficient curved path. This inefficiency went unnoticed for months until someone casually mentioned it and suddenly they had to redo all the calculations. Moment 42. Early spacecraft designers didn't include adequate windows for astronauts to see outside during launch and ascent. They were literally going to space blind. NASA eventually added windows, but the fact that this wasn't a primary consideration from the beginning is stunning. Moment 43. NASA once spent significant resources developing emergency procedures for astronauts to exit a spacecraft in the ocean if it splashed down during re-entry. The procedures were incredibly complicated, involving releasing explosive bolts and swimming through compartments. They practiced this extensively. It never happened the way they planned. Modern spacecraft just have simpler hatches, and astronauts just swim out. Here's what all of this tells us. Confidence and intelligence don't always align. Some of the brightest minds ever assembled made decisions that seem absurd in hindsight. They weren't dumb. They were working with incomplete information, untested theories, and the pressure of doing something that had never been done before. The difference between genius and ridiculous is often just whether it works. The space program worked, barely, despite decisions that make you wonder how anything got to space at all. So the next time someone tells you that history was driven by logical people making reasonable choices, remember that we got to the moon while operating under the assumption that the human body couldn't survive the vibrations of a rocket launch. If you had to pick just one of these moments as the dumbest decision in early space exploration, which one would it be? Let me know in the comments.